So we have another day of court in a freezing courthouse. It's very cold in there, on purpose, I believe. They don't seem to be able to get the temperature up. It shouldn't be that complicated, but we have a freezing courthouse.
Trump back in a cold courtroom this morning for his hush money trial. More on that in a moment. But first, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is back in the headlines. This time after he declared that the Sunshine State, quote, will not comply with changes to Title IX that the Biden administration recently unveiled, which includes protections for transgender students. And the latest in the Israel-Hamas war. Humanitarian aid is on its way to Gaza. A senior military official said the area could get the crucial assistance by early May. Here to discuss all that and more is Julia Manchester, national politics reporter for The Hill. Julia, my friend, thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to see you, Michael.
So let's first start off with our leading story, Trump's legal proceedings. Today, we'll cap off the first week of witness testimony in his hush money trial. Jurors all week have heard a lot from David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer. How did this first week go for Trump?
Look, it was certainly an interesting first week. I mean, of course, we have David Pecker being the first major witness, or I believe the first witness in this trial. But on top of that, you've also had the future of Trump's gag order, whether it will be imposed or not, whether he's going to face punishment for, violating it. That's a big question as well. But with David Pecker, there was really some interesting testimony yesterday, essentially saying that the National Enquirer, which David Pecker used to be the publisher of, was involved in essentially quashing negative stories about figures, not only Donald Trump, but also figures like actor Mark Wahlberg or former California governor and actor Arnold Schwarzenegger. So we got a little insight into that. But I think what the prosecution is really trying to drive home with David Pecker's testimony and on how he's quashed these negative stories is what differentiates Trump from Schwarzenegger or Wahlberg is that Trump was running for president. And that really goes into their election interference argument here, that this played a role in interfering in the 2016 election.
So that was the courthouse in Manhattan, but there was also proceedings that Trump was the subject of at the Supreme Court yesterday. The bench hearing arguments about whether or not Trump is immune from prosecution for official actions he took while president. The justices appear to be open to some sort of presidential immunity for Trump, which would likely delay those legal proceedings. I mean, that's essentially what he's trying to do here, right? Kick any decisions until after the election, or if he gets lucky, have the case be tossed overall.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is the goal of the Trump team. They want this case and potentially the other cases. We know that the hush money trial that's ongoing right now, that's the only case that's really guaranteed to wrap up before the election. But he wants these other cases delayed. So when, if he wins the election in November, there's still this question of immunity, assuming, he takes on the presidency and we see those other cases delayed and there's a big question over them. So that's what you're seeing the Trump team try to do. But it was interesting during the testimony, or I guess the hearing, I should say, yesterday in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justices, the liberal and conservative justices, were throwing around a lot of hypotheticals about this idea of presidential immunity. And one of the biggest parts of it was when, Justice Sonia Sotomayor essentially asked if a sitting president, ordered the political assassination of an opponent, if they would be immune from an act like that. And Trump's attorney basically suggested it's very possible. So a lot of eyebrow raising, a lot of hypotheticals in that. And it just, I think, goes to show that we're really in uncharted waters here. I think there's a lot of questions from the legal and the political community as to how to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, a really fascinating and noteworthy hearing of those oral arguments yesterday. Julia, another headline from the Supreme Court. Conservative Justice Samuel Alito is jumping into this debate over fetal rights. This is part of the case about whether Idaho's ban violated a federal emergency care law that could be used to further the fight for fetal rights. Now, the issue of abortion and women's reproductive rights played a huge role, I don't think that can be understated, in the 2022 midterm results, blunting those expectations of a red wave. Policy-wise, Democrats aren't happy to see this question before the court again, but politically, could it help propel them to victories again this cycle? Democrats know how to message on the issue of abortion. Republicans still haven't figured it out.
You're absolutely right. So you have Florida, where there's an abortion ballot measure that's going to be up for a vote in the general election in November, and that state's 6 weeks abortion ban is set to go into effect, I believe, next week. So voters in Florida will decide whether to enshrine abortion rights in the state's constitution in November. And then you have that 1864 era law in Arizona going into effect. And then you have the situation in Idaho. So essentially, what Republicans were hoping would happen when Roe versus Wade was overturned was it would be overturned, and they said, okay, it's up to the states, no longer an issue, at least nationally. The problem is, though, you're seeing this popping up in a number of states, and these trends really starting to form, and Democrats, very skillfully arguing that abortion rights are still in jeopardy because of the state level. So they're able to make that argument. Vice President Kamala Harris is set to travel to Jacksonville, Florida next week to, on the day actually that ban is supposed to go into effect. So Democrats are still making this a national issue, and they're good at it. So we'll see if it ends up trumping the economy, no pun intended. But I think Republicans have their work cut out for them when it comes to messaging on abortion.
Yeah, Democrats are trying to push this issue of abortion. Republicans still doing full court press on immigration. Julia, you mentioned Florida. Let's stay there and talk about Governor Ron DeSantis. No longer on the campaign trail, but still making plenty of news on his own. The Biden administration last week rolled out a set of changes to Title IX. Of course, that's the federal civil rights law that prohibits sex-based discrimination at government-funded schools. Now, essentially, these changes reinstituted protections for student survivors of sexual assault and harassment that were nixed during the Trump administration. DeSantis came out swinging, saying Florida will, quote, not comply with the changes and, quote, will fight back. What's his play here? I mean, is this just another flashpoint in the GOP's culture wars?
I think it certainly plays a role in the GOP's culture wars. I don't think this is any surprise. I think with transgender issues, Ron DeSantis has been one of the most vocal critics, and he's pushing back against this. The way Republicans and cultural conservatives are trying to frame this, it's as a women's rights issue. So they say that the Biden administration is infringing on women's rights in Florida by allowing transgender women to be treated equally to women who were people who are born biologically a woman. So that's a big question there. But, I think this is another flashpoint in the culture wars. I'm sure there will be a lot of resistance to this in Florida, but this is something that Ron DeSantis has really liked to push in Florida.
Yeah, I mean, to put it lightly. Shift away from politics for a second. Let's check in on those pro-Palestine protests that are taking over college campuses really across the country. Let's zero in on California, though. University of Southern California canceled its main commencement ceremony after it faced criticism for disinviting the valedictorian from delivering a speech because of, quote, safety concerns, as people are upset with pro-Palestinian posts she made on social media. What other new developments are here? This is sort of an expanding, exploding story about these protests that are taking place on college campuses.
Well, we're seeing these protests, which really started at Columbia University and spread to the University of Texas and then California, and really even here in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University. We're seeing these spread across the country, and we're actually hearing Gazans and Palestinians who have had to deal with the war and live through the war expressing their solidarity with these protesters. But on the flip side of this, obviously among Jewish Americans, among Israeli Americans, there's a real concern that some of these protesters, or a chunk of these protesters, are anti-Semitic, and their safety as Jewish and Israeli Americans and Jewish and Israeli students is very much up in the air right now. So, you have two sides of this issue, two groups who feel, worlds apart, but feel unsafe in their, own way. But we're seeing this really just blow up on college campuses. You're seeing, universities take a very hard line approach to trying to quash these protests, the encampments. And I think it might be not serving them well, at least in terms of public images. I mean, you see those images of these protesters being thrown to the ground. Obviously there could be, some wrongdoing there. I'm not sure, but there's it's not ultimately a good look.
Yeah, I don't think that this topic is going to die down anytime soon. But let's stick with the Israel-Hamas war. A senior military official told reporters yesterday that the U.S. is on track to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza by early May through a maritime corridor. Talk about how big of a development this is, because there's been a lot of talk about the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza, a lot of concerns raised about that. It's been a big weak spot for President Biden on the campaign trail, but now officials are saying aid is on the way.
I mean, it's a big development, and I think it's something the Biden administration wants to point to, because President Biden himself is in a very tricky situation, wanting to call out Israel for, alleged war crimes, while at the same time wanting to express his support for Israel and how Israel says it defends itself. So this is a way I think he can offer an olive branch, offer very much needed humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people, while at the same time sort of walking that fine line and understanding that this is an incredibly sensitive issue. We know that a lot of President Biden's base, progressive base in the Democratic Party, aren't happy with how he's handled the war. Many of them are on those protesters on college campuses. So this is something I think, he could potentially point to. But, most importantly, I mean, this is aid going to people who very much badly need it.
Yeah, that's for sure. Julia Manchester, Hill's national politics reporter, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A UN resolution to ban nuclear weapons in space was voted down this week. Russia, the sole vote against the U.S.-backed resolution, calling it, quote, dirty spectacle. The final vote in the 15-member council was 13-1, with China abstaining, but that was enough to kill the resolution. It called on all countries to not develop or deploy nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction in space. U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield called Russia's no vote, quote, baffling and a shame. The Russian ambassador fired back, pointing out that the U.S. voted against a proposed amendment from Russia and China that would have banned the placement of all weapons, not just WMDs, from space. Shifting gears now, Secretary of State Antony Blinken rounded out his 3-day visit to China Friday by meeting with President Xi Jinping. It all comes just days after President Biden signed that foreign aid bill that promised $8 billion for the Indo-Pacific region, including Taiwan. Blinken said he expressed worries about both Taiwan and Russia as Beijing continues to back Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Also discussed was the rapid escalations in Myanmar's civil war. Regional experts say that conflict poses a threat to both American and Chinese interests and may serve as a rare opportunity for cooperation between the two countries as an already long list of differences grows. Democrats are urging the Drug Enforcement Administration to swiftly take marijuana off the list of Schedule I substances. Senators Elizabeth Warren and John Fetterman and Representatives Barbara Lee and Earl Blumenauer are leading that fight, penning a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland. The association is currently reviewing marijuana's classification as a Schedule I substance. The category is used for drugs with no medical use and a high risk of abuse. The Department of Health and Human Services recommended last year that marijuana be reclassified as Schedule III. And former longtime CBS News anchor Dan Rather will make a brief return to the network on Sunday, a live interview appearance 18 years after his contentious exit. Rather will sit down with Lee Cowan to help promote an upcoming documentary about the legendary news anchor. Rather's ouster from CBS News came after a 2004 60 Minutes 2 report about then-President George W. Bush's National Guard record. Bush quickly slammed the network as CBS was unable to verify documents Rather used in his story. And that's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Mychael Schnell. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.